the act of creation of the universe was an act of love. We are here to try and better know and love that creator and this created order. We're here to love nature, to love the world, to love the fruits of God's creation, and we're here to love each other. And that's what the whole game is about.
One of the things I love is hearing from all of you, from listeners. And I know just in looking through the things that you send to me that people fit into several different categories. And I'm thinking right now of two specific categories of listeners that we have. One group are people who would say, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, I want to follow Jesus, but man, I'm discouraged. And I've seen some things that really make me wonder if I can keep at it, if I can keep going. Hear from people in that category. We also have a lot of atheists and agnostics that listen and who will say, well, I'm not a believer, but I'm curious and I want to know what it's like to believe and to engage in these kinds of conversations. And then we have a lot of other people who would say, look, I'm a committed believer, but I have people in my life who are not, and I'm trying to figure out how we should relate to one another. All of those categories are going to benefit from what we're talking about today, because I'm talking about a new book, relatively new book, called Why I Am Not an Atheist, The Confessions of a Skeptical Believer. And it's not the kind of book I think you would expect it to be, because with that title, what I thought it would be is someone who is giving kind of a testimony. Here was my atheism, and here's how I'm so regretful that I was ever in that period of life. It's not what this is. Or that it was some sort of argument showing people how to argue against atheists. That's not what it is either. This is instead not a dramatic conversion story. It's a stranger and slower thing than that. It's the account of somebody who grew up in a believing home, then became an atheist, understands atheists sympathetically from the inside out, and actually, as you'll hear in our conversation, is grateful for the time that he had as an atheist, but who also now is grateful to be a believer. And so one of the things that I really want to get at with this person is whether what he means by this is what some people mean when they say, well, religion's good for you, and so you ought to embrace religion. Is that what he's getting at? Or does he actually think that there's an empty hole in the ground in the Middle East and that Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father? That's what we're going to be exploring today. I'm Russell Moore. This is the Russell Moore Show, and my guest is Christopher Beha, novelist, former editor-in-chief of Harper's Magazine, and now the author of this book about faith and doubt, Why I'm Not an Atheist. This book I found fascinating because you introduce the topic not with a series of arguments, but with an experience that you had when you were 15 years old that kind of set the trajectory of your thinking about these questions of God. Can you explain for listeners who maybe haven't read the book yet what that was about, what that was like?
Sure. I had an experience of essentially a spiritual visitation in my youth. I was in bed, lying in bed, and I felt an angel of God come to me and press me down and sort of pin me to my bed and tell me to put my faith in God. And I was a student at Catholic school at the time. I was raised in a very devout Catholic family. So I had a context into which to place this. And I even had heard stories of family members who'd had, mystical experiences of direct relationship with the spiritual world, etc. But I didn't tell anyone about it. And these visions continued on and off at varying times over the course of many years that followed.
Did you tell anybody about it?
Yeah, I never, I don't believe that I ever spoke with anyone about it. There may have been once or twice that but it was certainly wasn't something I trumpeted, and I didn't tell people who, I didn't sort of confide it to people who were close to me. As a student at a Catholic school, I had spiritual advisors around me, including nuns and priests. I never went and spoke with them about it. I didn't tell my twin brother with whom I shared the room where this was happening. I kept it to myself as a private thing.
Is that because it scared you?
It was a little bit scary. It was a little bit inexplicable. Um, it wasn't because I thought, oh, people will think this is crazy. Because as I said, I was growing up within a context in which at least some people this would make sense to them. In a way, I think it felt like something very private, something for myself, and something very difficult to explain. Um, and I think, a lot of those kind of really direct, quasi mystical religious experiences are difficult to put into words. As I describe it in the book, as I put it to you now, this sort of like an angel came to me. That's using honestly quite mundane language for what the
Hmm.
experience was. There was a real experience of terror was part of it, but it was an incredibly forceful experience.
You experienced something that most people have to experience much later in their lives, and that's loss
Hmm.
and suffering and death. And you write about this with your twin brother. Talk about being in an ambulance with him on the way to the hospital and praying. Um, when you looked back on that, I mean, how did you process all of that at such a young age, and what did it teach you about prayer?
Well, for your listeners, I'll just say we were freshmen in college, my brother was in a bad car accident. He was a pedestrian struck by a car, and I rode with him in the ambulance. My sister went to school with us. She met us at the hospital. His oxygen levels started to drop, and we were told by a doctor that he wasn't going to make it through the night. And we prayed together, my sister and I, which is something that, given our upbringing, we would reflexively do. Um, and then he did make it. And in that sense, as I say, our prayers were answered. And yet this answered prayer sent me down a path that within fairly short order from there led to me leaving the church and thinking of myself as an atheist. And part of it was that the problem of suffering in the world was a problem that, the priests who had educated me had talked to me about. I was aware of that as a theological problem. I was aware of the problem of, theodicy, um, in an abstract sense. But like most adolescents, I had a fairly narrow sense of what suffering actually was. So suffering
Mhm.
to me was, um, the girl you wanted to go to the dance with liked someone else. Suffering
Mhm.
was you didn't make the varsity team. you know it was sometimes more than that. People close to you. I lost a grandparent, or but I didn't have a full sense of the range of suffering that existed out there in the world and what really was awaiting all of us. Um,
Mhm.
and when, even though my brother survived, I became acutely aware of the fact that many people in similar circumstances don't. That people do this abruptly lose the person closest to them. You know, um,
Mhm.
and in a way, the fact that it hadn't happened to us became its own problem, because was I supposed to believe that it was the prayer that had done it? And if so, was I supposed to believe that God looked down and saved some and didn't save others, and did it based on whether their brother and sister were praying in the hospital? You know,
Mhm.
um, I knew people who were actually much more devout than I was, who lived better lives than I did, who had not been spared in this way. So I couldn't believe that it was something that we had earned somehow, you know? And
Hmm.
so, in a certain way, the answered prayer became more of an intellectual problem than the unanswered prayer would have. The unanswered prayer would have been much more
Hmm.
of an emotional problem, but this was an intellectual problem. And then
Did did that happen all at once, or was this a slow process for
it
you?
was a slow process, all of this is happening, as I say, my freshman year in college. I you know did not go to a Christian or Catholic college, and there was plenty of religious life on campus, but there was also plenty that wasn't. And it's a time in life where people naturally start to question the values they were raised in and see what else is out there. It's a time in life where your parents aren't there to make you go to church if you don't want to. You have to kind of, as an independent adult, start to decide what your priorities are, what your values are, what kind of life you're going to live, on what terms, etc. So all of that was already probably a little bit in process and was going to be in process around this time of life anyway, I'm sure.
You talk about when you refer to this atheistic period in your life, you actually value those years as
Absolutely.
formative for you. What did the atheism give you that your faith had not?
Well, because I was raised in the Catholic Church. I was raised with parents who both had themselves been raised in the Catholic Church. I went to Catholic school. I went to the same Catholic school my father had gone to. My sister was going to the same Catholic school my mother had gone to. Um, we were in a I mean, everyone was quite devout and believing, and plenty of people in that milieu were not always going to mass. Were not always, but it was the context in which we lived. There was something slightly default about it, um, and I think that what I came to value was skepticism. And when I thought of myself, I didn't want to think of myself as an atheist. That wasn't my self-description. Many atheists will say, you know, there are endless possible, imaginary beings and deities, and I don't want to be defined by the fact that I happen not to believe in your one, or whatever. It's like they
Hmm.
say, well, that's not, I don't believe in your God, but that's not who I am.
Hmm.
So I thought of myself as a skeptic. And meaning I have a particular cast of mind, or I want to have a particular cast of mind that doesn't accept things just because some authority tells me to, that tries to sort things out for myself, that relies mostly on reason in doing so, that evaluates evidence, and that comes to conclusions about claims based on that evaluation, not based on what I was raised to believe or what people who are supposed to know better tell me, etc. And it was important to me, and people who know the history of skepticism know that actually there is a robust tradition of Christian skepticism and religious skepticism, and Montaigne, the great French essayist Michel de Montaigne, is a central figure in this. And he sort of argued that if skepticism shows you the limits of human knowledge, of what can be known through reason, then it's precisely that calls for an act of faith. You know,
Hmm.
um, so when I became a skeptic, I imagined that skepticism and religious belief were two mutually exclusive ways of being in the world. I eventually came to be, as I understand it, a skeptical believer, someone who does believe, um, but does so from this skeptical approach, not because it was what I was raised in, not because of any authority, but because I am trying to make sense on a personal level of my experience in the world. And that experience suggests to me that this is the best explanation. Um, and I'm glad to have arrived in that position. And I don't think I would have arrived in that position without, I went from being a believer to being a skeptic to being a skeptical believer. And I think all of those steps were necessary to arrive where I
Hmm.
did.
I want to explore in a minute what skeptical believing is like, but before we do that, I found it really I really appreciated several things about the way that you described atheism. One of those being a very sympathetic from the inside sort of look here, but also because You don't talk about atheism as one thing or as just the subtraction
Hmm.
of belief away. So for people out there, maybe for religious people who they've got a loved one who says, "I'm an atheist." What does that necessarily tell them and not tell them about
Yeah,
where that person is?
yeah. Um, so I think that there are lots and lots of people, perhaps the majority of people, who don't fundamentally ask or try and answer for themselves questions about like the ultimate nature of reality or how we have knowledge, or they probably do ask ethical questions at least sometimes, and they are faced with, even if they're not asking ethical questions, constantly faced with choices that have to be made on the basis of some set of underlying values, you know? So they inevitably have a worldview, um, that, but it might not be that well articulated to them. So I wouldn't say that all atheists or most atheists would define for themselves this being what they believe. But I'd say that the atheists who have thought very hard about what a reality without belief in a transcendent God looks like and how you operate within that reality have tended, at least in the modern West, to cluster around two sort of viewpoints. And one is materialism, and in particular, what I call scientific materialism, which basically just means physical matter is all that there is. Um, one. And two, we can know that physical matter, know the world outside of our heads through our senses. Um, and in particular, through objectifying our senses through quantification, experimentation, etc. But the way that the sciences work is how we get real knowledge. And anything that you cannot apply that scientific method to doesn't really exist. Anything that comes to you as a piece of knowledge through some other form isn't really knowledge, because knowledge has to be about the physical material world, because that's all there is. Okay. So that's one. Um, and that's, for example, the new atheists who are, actually surprisingly not well remembered these days.
Yeah.
If you and I both know circa 2005, 2006, 2007, what a big deal these guys are. And if you speak with younger people now, even younger atheists, and bring them up, you have to explain what this movement was. But
Yeah, you have to say Richard Dawkins is the guy that was debating Jordan Peterson, and
yes,
then they know.
totally,
Yeah,
totally. So the Dawkins, that's a Dawkins kind of atheism, right? That is very often the proponents of it are themselves scientists who study the physical material world. Um, and then the other version is what I call romantic idealism, and that is kind of almost the mirror image. It says that all that really exists, or all that we can know, are our subjective experiences of reality. We can't ever transcend our point of view and our experience to get at something outside of our head. It's always what's coming into us. Um, Scientific materialists want to separate out the emotions and our passions, from reason and from our sort of objective view of the world, right? A romantic idealist says that's not possible, and part of knowledge really is our emotions. So they tend to valorize emotion, and the ethic is an ethic of authenticity, of being true to yourself and your subjective experience. And this is the atheism of Nietzsche, who's perhaps the most famous atheist thinker who ever lived. It's the atheism of a lot of the existentialists. So it is a very robust atheist tradition. Although, if you speak to the Richard Dawkinses and Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, and they tell this story, they will leave those atheists out, because those are fundamentally irrational atheists by their own description. They don't valorize reason. They valorize passion and emotion. Um, and what the scientific materialists want to say is that what it means to be an atheist is to be guided by reason, not to be guided by our hopes and fears, but to be guided by, what we can know. So those two, they're often historically have been as hostile to each other, these two schools, as they have been to religious faith. So those are two very different ways of being atheists. And I'm not saying there aren't others as well, but I think broadly speaking, those two, almost all modern Western atheists who can articulate a worldview, it will fall into one of these two camps.
So if a son or daughter of a Christian comes home and says, "Mom and Dad, I've been away at college. I think I'm an atheist now." Right now, which of those categories would more likely to be the kind of atheist?
I think right now the answer is romantic idealism. I think when I became an atheist in college 25 years ago, it was scientific materialism. Atheists tended to be people who said, enough with this superstition. I know the world. I'm going to use science to understand what's actually out there, and they tended, on balance, to be materialists. Today, um, they tend instead to be, there might be some identity politics to it. There might be some new age type spirituality to it. But what they will say instead, as the existentialists do, is I'm not going to accept this prefabricated narrative that is the Christian tradition because I need to live in a way that's true to myself. And so it's not, that's not true to my reality, that sort of thing. So that kind of language, that I think is much more common in this generation of atheists, on both the left and the right, I think there's a lot of people in sectors of the younger, like very online right, who have, including people who go in for some pretty baroque quasi-spiritual conspiracy theories and things like that. But I think that kind of atheism exists throughout the sort of spectrum, and is increasingly the more common one.
I've asked others this question, and I am curious of your answer to it because I've been thinking about it a lot for a long time. When I first started out in doing these things that I do, if I went onto a university campus, secular university campus, and you said, "Find the Christian faculty members here," I would probably go first to the English department, where I would find someone who's Chesterton influenced, or Lewis influenced, or Tolkien influenced, something like that. And I would not go to the hard sciences. That would be the least likely place for me to find Christians. Now it seems to be completely reversed, where when I go onto a campus, I'll find Christian astrophysicists and biologists and hard scientists of various kinds. And the English department in most of these places is the least likely place to find someone who has religious commitment. Has something changed to make that happen, or is this just the fluctuations of life?
Well, I can only speculate on this outside of my wheelhouse. I uh, am interested in these social trends about atheism, but I don't study them deeply. But I
Mm-hmm.
would say that the older version of atheism I'm talking about really valorized the sciences. That's part of what scientific materialism is, and the newer one really valorizes the imagination, and so it's going to be more attractive to people in the humanities. I also think that the older version, again, it really valorized reason and a conception of ourselves as people who can know things about the world. Right. And the newer version tends to valorize this idea that meaning is something we create. Um, the great pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty put it. He said we do not discover truth, we construct it, and all of the um, in the humanities, the sort of talk about the construction of various things, like that used to be taken as immutable categories. Um, that is in keeping with this romantic idealist view, and so that's very attractive to people who are in the humanities. And then the flip side, I think, also about, so that might explain half of what you're saying. Richard Dawkins has recently sort of started describing himself as something like a cultural Christian. He doesn't
Hmm.
believe in Christian metaphysics, but he has a little more respect than he used to for the Christian tradition and for um, basically the Anglophone West in particular as having values that arose out of Christianity. And I think those new atheists, even back when they were writing 20 plus years ago, were often critical as they were going along of, they were in an academy where there was this growing sense of postmodernism and relativism and things like that, and they were quite critical of that. And in fact, they saw it as a species of religion because it was fundamentally irrational, things like that. So I think that if you're a scientist who feels that there is a growing brand of atheism that denies what you take to be reality, and in particular that denies sort of the primacy of physical reality, you might look to a theistic tradition and say, um, one of the things that you get when you start from the premise that we live in this created order, right? That the world, the physical material world, was created by God, um, is the belief that you got to take the physical world seriously. You can't deny its reality, and it doesn't always do exactly what you want it to do. It's not up to you. And so I think some people are starting to say, "Oh, this is actually a tradition that takes the reality as a scientist understands it actually pretty seriously, not a tradition that denies that reality."
What category would you put the more typical person that I talk to these days who's lost faith? Very different from when I first started out in ministry. When usually then what somebody would say is really either of those categories that you mentioned, which I've never thought to put them in those frames before, but they resonate with them. Either to say, look, I've been studying science and I've come to the conclusion that the miracles that I believed could happen just couldn't. So I no longer can believe in virgin births and what have you, and so now I'm an atheist. Or they would say, I think the morality of the church that I grew up in is too strict, and I don't like that, and I want to do what I want here. Now, it's more likely usually that I talk to somebody who says, I encountered some really evil things in the church. I saw I saw some things. It goes beyond just there are hypocrites in the church. Kind of, it's always been there. I've seen something kind of behind the veil that makes me think this is evil. How would you describe that kind of atheism?
Well, I mean, I guess I don't know if that would necessarily qualify as atheism in the sense that, so I'm coming again from the Catholic tradition. A lot of people who have been really shaken by enormous institutional failures of the Catholic Church over the past generation have have left the church and have felt this can't be my home anymore, and then have not gone to find some other spiritual home, but have just moved away from it. Um, but they haven't necessarily denied the existence of God because of that. They've just said, they might say, I'm I don't need this mediating force. I don't need this structure of, you know, old unmarried men who, have never lived a normal life in the world, who are going to tell me what I should and should not do. I can, so then they step away on that basis. Now, my own experience is that a an ongoing spiritual practice of some kind is incredibly important for me to continue to feel the closeness of God in my life, to feel that relationship.
Hmm.
It's difficult to do on your own. That's why these institutions grew up over time, and that's why
Hmm.
so many people have devoted themselves to the institutions. And so, um, it probably, then happens if you're someone who has decided that you can't, for frankly legitimate reasons, that you have some real problems with these institutions, and then you decide to take the go it alone option. It's just a hard option, and so what starts to happen is, you just start to kind of slip away from having any active relationship with God at all.
Did it, when you were in your pure skeptic phase, did it bother you, some of the questions? Where did everything come from? How did something come from nothing? What prompted the Big Bang? Were those sorts of questions bothering at all to you, or did you feel like you had a grasp on those things at the time?
Some of these questions bothered me, and they bothered me enough that, I spoke about these two different schools. Um, I spent very little time within this scientific materialist school, even though that's what the big firebrand new atheists of that moment were advocating. I read all of those people, but I didn't feel like I was one of them. I did think, pretty much right off the bat, that materialism as a worldview had some real problems to it. It was less things like the where did the reality come from and what happened before the Big Bang. And it had a lot to do with consciousness, a lot to do with the
Mm.
fact of us having subjective experiences that it seemed to me quite obviously weren't themselves matter. Even if you
Hmm.
could say that they arose entirely from uh, active processing going on in our brains. Even if someone could figure out some way where they could look at the MRI and they could say exactly where each conscious thought originated in the brain, which synapse firing was, putting the funny hat on my aunt in my dream. It still wouldn't mean that the hat and the brain were the same thing. There still
Yeah.
seemed to me like there was something that wasn't matter. So that was an issue for me all along, which is why I became very attracted to this more idealist view that instead started with the reality of each human being as a subjective willing agent. That free will is also another thing that materialism has a very, very, very hard time with.
Ross Douthat a couple of weeks ago had Amidite, CEO of Anthropic, on his show, who said, uh, honestly don't know if Claude is conscious. I don't know how to determine that. And Ross's point was to say, setting aside the question of whether an AI can have consciousness, there are ramifications to people feeling as though AI has consciousness. Do you think that if you had been considering these things now, at a time when there's at least the ability for people to think, oh, I can see how a completely material reality or digital reality can give rise to something that feels like consciousness, would that have been a stumbling block for you?
I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. One, I still don't see how. I don't
Mm.
think there's anything about what we know right now, um, that shows us how that happens. We don't have any evidence of any kind of artificial processing giving rise to consciousness. And what's more, the fact that, on some level we could never know, right?
Yeah.
This is, at what point does the Turing machine that has been trained to tell you it's conscious, at what point do you have to believe it? Because AI will tell you now, I have a rich inner life full of, hopes and dreams and fears, right?
Hmm.
Um, but someone could have programmed a TI-82 calculator to do that 20 years ago too. So saying it, having the ability somehow to express it, obviously isn't what does it, right? So what is? Where are we going to draw the line? One of the reasons, the fact that that's such a challenging question to answer, to me actually confirms the underlying point that we can
Mm.
never look in the scientific way from the outside at some kind of processing going on in an object and saying that's what consciousness is,
Mm.
including in our own brains. So, and that is why we have this issue of, how are we ever going to know if these entities were creating our conscious?
Just anecdotally, most of the people that I know who have made some sort of jump from maybe from the first kind of atheism to the second kind of atheism that you're talking about here, or from atheism to theism or even Christianity or something else, often it's prompted by the birth of a child or something along those lines, where there's some sense of love and mystery that seems bigger than what they have known. It seems to me that's in some ways your experience, that question
Mm.
of love. How did that work out in your own life?
So the form it took for me was meeting my wife. And so it was, but it was about love, absolutely. And then, we do have two children, and they have definitely enriched this feeling. Um, the romantic idealist tradition that I was talking about, it tends to be pretty pessimistic. And some of the romantic idealists spend a lot of time talking about suicide, including
Mm-hmm.
Camus, who said it was the only serious philosophical question was why one should not commit suicide. Um, and some of them have an almost Buddhist sense of the proper response to the world is to withdraw and not make connections and to avoid willing anything and to avoid suffering. Or they flip that to the Nietzschean, you should actually celebrate the will, and you should kind of try to dominate others and things like that. And what they don't have a good sense of is engaging in the world as a beautiful place, um, and loving this order we're in and loving other people, and allowing sometimes um, that their needs are more important than your own, etc. So when I met my wife and uh, fell very much in love with her, and found to my great fortune that love was returned. I felt an enormous amount of gratitude. Um, I wanted sort of somewhere to put that gratitude, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to respect it, acknowledge it in some way, and I wanted to orient my life around it in some way. And I started for the first time in a long time going regularly to church again, and I started hearing these stories that had been the stories that I'd grown up with, but I had not thought of in this context. But, the stories that said God is love. And the stories that said that, Jesus's one commandment to us, or two commandments, is to love God and to love our neighbor. Is that we're love made everything. The act of creation of the universe was an act of love. We are here to try and better know and love that creator and this created order. We're here to love nature, to love the world, to love the fruits of God's creation, and we're here to love each other. And that's what the whole game is about. And that was not how I would have summarized the Christian message when I was a 12-year-old altar boy. I don't know if that's my own fault or, why that is, but when I returned in this context, um, I felt it very strongly. And it seemed to me that this is actually what was being said very explicitly, you know. And when we And then there's another thing, and some people have a really hard time with this element of Christianity, but it was a message about my own fallenness and my own need for help. Um, but coupled with the idea of needing to accept my need for help was the assurance that that help was out there, that that help
Mm.
could be had, you know. And so a lot of people I know don't like the Christian message because they feel what it's saying to them is there's something wrong with you, you know. You're
Hmm.
sinful, you're fallen, you're not doing it right, you know. But part of the Christian message is no one's doing it right. Um, and also part of the Christian message is that God loves you anyway. And so those are really important parts of it, you know. And then the other thing I think is that for me, I think, you know, and this is judge not lest you be judged, but is just that the true meaning of Christianity, besides going out into the world with love for others and trying to act on that, is to the extent that you're worried about making moral judgments, that needs to be turned inward. Your idea, you need to be checking on yourself and saying, "Am I living up to the Christian ideal?" I don't know if I suspect you would not go this far. I don't know. You can tell me. I don't think it's my job to check on anyone else. I don't think it's my job to walk around the world and look at each person and say, are you doing it right? Are you doing it right? And that goes for, you know, my immediate neighbors, the people I read about in the newspaper, whatever. I just feel like throughout our society, on every, you know, corner or whatever, there's a lot of people who are and believers and unbelievers who are constantly engaged in an active moral judgment of others. They consider it that's what I'm supposed to do. They're constantly
Hmm.
applying purity tests. They're constantly checking, you know, um, can I root for this hockey team
Yeah.
because of what one of them said, you know, in a press conference or on a phone call? They're constantly just always trying to figure out, is this person good enough for me, for my test, you know?
Mm.
And that's from my standpoint, that's between that person and God. And I need to worry about, am I good enough? That's really my call, you know? Where am I coming short? What can I do to be more loving? What can I do to more fully engage in this beautiful creation that has been given to me as a gift?
I think most people, when they assume some sort of transition from atheism out of it to something else, they assume that first the belief is hammered out. Somebody goes on this investigation to hammer out the belief. And then the last step is to find a church and to start attending. Sounds like you did that completely the other way, that there was a kind of belonging before there was a reconsideration, at least consciously, of belief. Is that right?
Yes. And I think it's, you know, I guess one of the ironies of the book is that an enormous amount of the book is taken up with my reading and with my trying to figure these problems out for myself. Um, and then it ends with some, you know, consideration of some of the mystic tradition, a Christian existentialism of the Kierkegaardian sort. But that
Hmm.
basically says you need to stop thinking that you can. I'll step back and I'll say the modern era, right? The end of the sort of era of Christendom, in a lot of ways, begins with again Michel de Montaigne retreating to his castle from political life, sitting at home writing his essays, sitting alone in a room. Right. The next great
Hmm.
figure after that is Descartes. Descartes sits in his heated room to say, what can I know? I'm going to start by doubting everything. What can I know? And he gets to the I think, therefore I am. Right. This idea that you can sit alone in a room and reason yourself abstractly to the truth, and that once you have done that, you take that truth and you go out and act in the world with it. That's not in practice what happens. What happens, to use the Heideggerian term, is you're thrown into the world. You're in the world. You don't get to escape to the room by yourself. The time is ticking, and you've got to be in the world, and you've got to make your choices as you go, and so you can't just sit and read a book and figure out the answer. You have to go out into the world and do it. And this is, what Kierkegaard's leap of faith. He has an amazing image of someone who wants to make sure they know how to swim before they get into the water, so they
Hmm.
won't drown. So they hang on a pulley above the water, doing the strokes, practicing the strokes. But you don't know how to swim until you're in the water. And you
Hmm.
just got to get in there and start kicking around. Um, and I also think that so much of what religion is about, for me, what faith is about, is religious experience, is that feeling, that loving feeling of having a relationship with God. And you can't think your way to that. Think your way to it's possible that I could have a relationship with God and then go into it. You've got to start putting yourself out there. It's, to make a somewhat glib comparison, it's like going on a first date or something. You can't
Hmm.
decide by reading someone's online profile that this is the person I'm gonna love for the rest of my life. You got to go meet them in a spirit of openness and try and find out what they're like. um, so that's, and I come from a tradition, the Catholic tradition, that obviously cares a lot um, about ritual, and also about, has a great artistic um, history bound up with the liturgy. Cares a
Yeah.
lot about this experience that comes out of it. My wife was raised Episcopalian, and when I took her to mass, sometimes her response is, "What's with all this incense? It's making me sneeze. What does that have to do with God? What is, lighting a smelly cake?" It's like, um, but what the Catholic Church has a great respect for is the idea that, part of having this relationship is getting in an experience that engages all of the senses, including the smell, and, that has the beautiful, but it's, so you can't sit alone in a room and work in some abstract way through the idea of what that experience is going to be like, and then decide, okay, that's going to be a valuable experience for me. You got to go do it.
Flannery O'Connor said in one of her letters, "Conviction without experience is harshness, or leads to
That's
harshness."
wonderful. Yeah. And I think the some people have a very hard time just giving it a try. you know it feels
Yeah.
a little embarrassing, it feels a little fake. you know I think, I sometimes, this is an analogy that I make, which is, we all know people who are quite cynical, and they kind of assume the worst of people, right? And they go
Yeah.
through the world expecting to be ripped off, and expecting, thinking with a worldview that everyone's always trying to get one over on you. And
Yeah.
then, if that's the view you go into the world with, right, the world responds in kind. Then people are distrustful of you. Then you sense that, whatever. So imagine that person, and then imagine that they're just so deeply unhappy and having a hard time making human connections, that a therapist or something says to them, "I want you to go out in the world and assume the best of people instead. I want you to assume that other people are kind and charitable and you can trust them." Right? And that person would say, "But that's not what I think. That's
Hmm.
not how the world is." And this person's like, "Just try it. Just try the assumption. The next time someone acts in a certain way to you, ask yourself, if I were the kind of person who assumed the best, how would I read this?" And then try and do it that way. And I think we both know that if that person did it, they would have, again, find the world responding to them in a particular way. All of a sudden, the world would not seem like such a dark, cynical place. And they would be like, "Wow, people can be kind." And people. But the first thing they need to get over is their sense of, that's fake. I'm not going to
Yeah.
pretend to think something I don't think, you know? Um,
Yeah.
and a lot of people, that's how they feel about going to church is I'm not going to go in there and say the creed and do this stuff. I don't believe it. And what you want to say is, well, you don't know whether you believe it yet. And it is actually a thing that you have to try to believe before you can know whether you believe it, you know? And that's not something that a scientific materialist type could ever accept, this idea that you can choose what you believe, you know, because
Yeah.
they'd say, like, I believe what my senses tell me. I believe what I know.
You call yourself a skeptical believer
Yeah.
now. I wonder. Frederick Buechner used to always talk about this moment from Barth, quote from Barth, where Karl Barth, where he said, "People will sometimes go into the church. The preacher will ascend the pulpit, open the Bible, and for a split second, they're wondering, is he finally going to tell me whether or not it's true?" And so I wonder, for you being a skeptical believer, do you believe that it's true, not just in the sense that you're just talking about, that it actually does connect you to community and to love and to so forth, but Jesus is raised from the dead? I mean,
I do.
the facts that are the assertions that are hard for
Yes.
some people to believe.
Yes. Yes. I am not someone who wants to say, um, it's all a metaphor. You need to believe it metaphorically. And I'm trying to sort of reassure the secular world. Don't worry, you don't actually need to get into all this crazy superstitious stuff. It's really just about loving each other. Um,
Hmm.
I believe it. I do. And what I will say is, most of the time I do. You know,
Hmm.
I don't know. If obviously you read like the Lives of the Saints, there's a lot of these stories of the dark nights of the soul and things like that.
Yeah.
I think that if someone said that they always believed it, that they never doubted it, I would almost wonder if they are taking it seriously enough. You know, because they
Hmm.
are. They are really, really profound claims. It ought to feel sometimes difficult to believe them, in my opinion,
Yeah.
you know? So, um, but then there are times where I believe them where they seem so obviously self-evidently true that for someone to try and get me not to believe them would be the equivalent of them trying to get me not to believe that you're on the other line somewhere having this conversation with me,
Hmm.
or that, the people walking around who, claim to have their own inner consciousness are really zombies or robots or AI, I can't
Yeah.
prove that's not true, but when I actually address these people with real openness, it's very clear to me that they have every bit as much going on inside their heads as I do in my own, So that kind of belief that can never actually be proven, but still you absolutely believe it. Um, I often enough have that feeling about these claims, about the virgin birth, about the resurrection, and then other times, frankly, there are times in my life where it feels as ridiculous to me as it feels to most atheists, But even in those times, I try to act as though I believe it. I try and act as though it were true, and I stay true to the the tradition I'm in and the spiritual practice I'm in that keeps me close to those beliefs. And I trust it's now been, about a decade since I've returned to faith. And those periods have never lasted, And if they
Hmm.
lasted, if I went through 6 months of not feeling it, of feeling that had died inside of me, I'm not sure what I would do.
Yeah.
That I hope it doesn't happen. Um, but for now, those feelings last a couple of hours, a couple of days, maybe a week. I don't know, but you if you keep coming and you keep showing up, then the what I see as the truth of reality shows itself to you back to you eventually.
Yeah. John the Baptist sent word from prison. Are you the one we're waiting for? Should we wait for another? And Jesus says he's the greatest of all of the prophets to that point. I wonder what advice you would give to two people. who are listening to this right now. Um, One of them is somebody who says, um, I find it really hard to believe, but I think I'm being drawn toward something. But it is really hard to go into a church and have everyone think, it's almost like it feels to people like I was wrong. I'm surrendering here and coming in when actually they're wanting to do what you're talking about. They're just kind of wanting to try things out and experience it. What advice you would give to that person? And then if there's someone else who says, I have a son or a daughter, I don't know whether they're going through a dark night of the soul or if they're actually losing their faith. How should I engage that child of mine? Should I bring it up or should I not? What advice would you give for those two listeners?
The first person, I think I would say just try to show up. And I would say that my experience with most faith communities um, is is that they're very welcoming, is that they believe they have good news to share, and in so many different parables, Jesus says, that the ones that he cherishes the most are the ones that were lost and then found. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, you know, if I can't speak for all communities, but I think that a community that's truly, following the spirit of Jesus, is not going to ask that you flagellate yourself for having, been out of the fold. They're instead
Mm-hmm.
going to say, how great this is that here you are. And then the other thing, as far as that goes, is um, the nice thing about this is you can you can show up once, and if it's not it's like, don't start with the um okay, now I'm going to commit to go to church for the rest of my life and to order my life around this.
Right.
You can start with small things, and then obviously something. I personally am a big believer in having a practice that involves a community, but the first thing that you can start with is praying. And you don't have to
Mm.
go anywhere else to do that. And you don't have to walk into a building and explain yourself to anyone else. You can just try
Yeah.
it and see what happens. Um, the other person, I think, the parent who has this child, um, you know, my book, the way that I've been putting it to people is I want it to be involved in conversations, not in arguments. Right.
Yeah.
And this makes it unlike a lot of books about God, uh, whether written by atheists or theists. Right. I want to make I want to say what I feel and what my experience has been in a way that I hope will resonate with some people, but that will allow other people also to talk about their experiences. So if you have someone, particularly as a child, but someone in your life who is, you know, whose journey is taking them, it seems like, away from you or away from what you think the right path is, um, I would just try to talk with them in an open way and try and understand what they're feeling, and not in a way that begins with a how do I get this person back on my side? How do I get this person back in here? You know?
Mm.
And I think there's just a big difference in the way those two conversations go, whether you are rhetorically beginning it as something you expect to be an argument, whether you're
Yeah.
trying to talk them into something or whether you're just trying to understand. Now, it's tough for parents to do that with children in general. You so often want the conversation to be you directing the child to the right place. I mean, I have a
Right. Yeah.
9-year-old and a 5-year-old. That's different than people who have a 29-year-old and a 25-year-old. But I imagine it stays with you, this sense that, like, my job is to tell this person what's right or wrong and what they should or should not do. But I've already learned with the 9-year-old and the 5-year-old that they are their own autonomous people. And that, one, if I'm constantly just trying to direct them to do what I want, they're going to rebel. But
Hmm.
also, two, that's not part of my job, again, going back to what a lot of this conversation has been about, is just to try to know them and love them. So, have the conversation in a spirit of openness, where if you say, I'm not sure what's going on with my kid right now, where they are spiritually, where they are, in their relationship with God, start from let me see if I can find out. First step. And don't even make that conversation about, let me see if I can find out so I can fix what's wrong. Just have the conversation.
The book is Why I Am Not an Atheist, The Confession of a Skeptical Believer. Christopher Beha, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.